Falcon is a very deep workstation, and with all of this power that's under the hood here, there is a learning curve that's going to be involved. So I wanted to put together a video that's going to include a handful of workflow tips for those who are just getting started with Falcon, or those who may have been struggling with getting started and developing a quick workflow. I think it's important to understand that we can load as many oscillators as we would like, as many filters, as many layers, effects that our processor can handle. But again, with all of that power comes some complexity. So let's go ahead and get started on this workflow tips video. And the very first thing that we're going to take a look at is the interface and just showing what we want to see or need to see and hiding some of the things that we don't. Now, within the edit view, which we can access by clicking on this tab up above, we have a bunch of different sections here, and these are going to all show by default, I believe. But just know that we can hide any of these sections that we may not be using or that we're not going to need for the session, our sound design session that we're beginning. Now, up in the top right corner, we can click on these icons here to hide the various sections. So we can see at the top, we have our program section, then we have our layers, key groups, oscillators, our mapping, and then our modulation. Now we also have an oscillator section, and that's not showing because I haven't loaded an oscillator yet. If I were to drag an audio sample over to our mapping editor and let's span that across the keyboard, I'll go ahead and release. And now we can see we have our oscillator section, which adds another layer, and we then have our amp envelope that pops up. Okay, so making use of these icons, these buttons up at the top, we can hide any section that we don't need to see. So clicking at the very top, here we have our program section. This icon matches here, so we can hide that if we'd like. We then have our layer section. We can hide that if we'd like. Our key groups, we can hide. Here's our oscillator. This is our oscillator icon. We can hide that. This is our mapping editor. We can hide, especially if we're going to be using an external controller. And then our modulation section. So here we have absolutely nothing. So one of the things that I really like to do within Falcon is work with sampling. And so if I'm going to do that, really, I would want to see my oscillator, which shows the sample that I've loaded in. If I want to see the controls for the sample, then I can click on this gear icon to bring those up. And then the key group section, this could be useful, as well as the layer. I may want to add some effects here. Now I can access the amp envelope for the sample oscillator by clicking on this button here. And this is within our key groups. There's a secondary area where we can access that as well, and that is our modulation section, this last icon to the right. Clicking that, then we can access it down below as well. So if we're going to work with something like sampling, this may be all that we need. So just know that we can always come up to the top and hide the various sections that we won't need in our session. But let's bring back the program layer and our mapping editor, just also so you can know that we can collapse these sections by clicking on the arrow in the upper left corner of each section. So these can be hidden in this way as well. So then if I'd like to see my amp envelope in the modulation section, I can show that, and then my key group, and then my oscillator, and the other ones are collapsed here. So then if I quickly need to hop up to my layer section, I can expand that out. Now, if we have a section expanded in this view, we can also tailor what's showing within the section as well. So with these buttons up at the top, each section is going to have these buttons. So the very top one is going to show or hide our parameters for that section. So if I click on that circle, those go away. We then have our effects, event, and mod. Effects, event, and mod here. So we can click to hide those for each section. So for our layer section, we can hide those as well. And then for our key groups, we have our parameters, which are here, our effects, which are here, and our mod. So for the key group section, we don't have that event field. But let's bring these back for each of our layers. And for the layer section, I'm actually going to quickly just add a delay here. And for the event section, I'll add an arpeggiator. So now let's move over to our tree view, and this is going to allow us to navigate the different sections as well, and this can help with our workflow. And then here I want to talk about this because we can show and hide different sections as well. So we have in the upper right corner these similar icons that we've taken a look at here in the edit view. So if we would like to see our effects, and I brought in the arpeggiator and the dual delay X, we can see those because this is highlighted here, but if I click, then we're going to hide that. The arpeggiator is actually an event processor, so we can hide that by clicking there. So this we can tailor as well. This is going to be our mods. So any modulation sources that we've added is going to show by clicking on this here. And then this one will show our aux effects nodes. So within the tree view, we have this same capability to show and hide things that we don't need to see to make it more manageable to navigate. Now we can also click on certain areas to show those things here. So by clicking on the sample, that's going to make that active, our layer. If we were to have multiple layers and multiple oscillators, then we could easily access those by clicking here within our tree view. So for example, on our oscillator section, if I click on the plus to add another oscillator, say the additive, we can now see our additive tab and our sample tab. If we're over in the tree view, then I can click on sample to show the sample, and then choose the additive to show that. And let's come up to the top, click on the wrench icon, and we're going to clear this multi out to start over from scratch. Let's collapse that automation. Now the next thing I'd like to talk about is all of the various ways in which we can go about adding our oscillators. And I've seen some videos where people are doing it really in the long way, and I kind of want to just show the different methods so you can choose which one works best for you and your workflow. Now the very first way, we can come over to the browser panel here. Let's click on the oscillator tab, and then here this is divided by sample and synthesis. So if we would like to load a sample oscillator, then we can expand that out. Let's show our mapping editor, and then I can click, hold, and drag to our mapping editor. Let's take this to the top. To span this across the entire range of our keyboard, I'll release that, and then now we have our sample, our stretch oscillator loaded here. Let's actually close the program layer and our layer section, and I'm going to collapse the modulation section as well. Now if I select the key group, I can press delete on the QWERTY keyboard to remove that, and let's come to the synthesis. This is going to function in the same way. So if I like to load a wavetable, then I can click, hold, and drag that, just as we did with the sample or the stretch oscillator. Let's go ahead and delete this key group as well. Now if we're working in the tree view, we have our layer here, and we can also right click on this and choose to add key group, and this is going to by default add a analog oscillator with our sine wave loaded up. Let's again delete out this key group. Now we can also right click in the mapping editor and come up to the top and create key group. We can choose between whether we'd like a sample template or the synth template. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And now again, we have our analog oscillator with the sine wave. Now if we'd like to set up two oscillators within our key group, we have this plus button here that we can click on, and then I can choose to add another oscillator here as well and choose which one I'd like to work with. And if we expand out our key group within the tree view, we can see our analog and drum here, which we can select as we saw a second ago. Now while in the tree view, I'm going to right click on key group and remove that node out. And probably my favorite way to get started is just to simply be sure that the mapping editor is active by clicking once, and I'll control in, and that's just going to bring in an analog oscillator. And then from this point, I can click and hold, and then I have a drop-down menu where I can choose the oscillator that I'd like to use, or we can also right-click and choose an oscillator as well. Let's remove that granular oscillator and delete our key group, and just know that I did control in, which is going to bring up that sample oscillator. If we control shift and N, then that's going to bring up our sample oscillator. Now we saw a moment ago, if we remove that key group out and I come to the browser section here, we drug in this bucket of tools audio sample, and I went to the top to span this across the keyboard. And so that's one way that we can do that. If we wanted to bring in multiple samples though, we can click to select one and then hold shift and select a group. I can then click, hold, and drag, and then these are going to be placed across the keyboard here. You can see how they're going to be divided up. If I were to come down to the bottom then we can even place these on individual keys. If I come down even further, then we can place these by velocity. So if I go ahead and release this, then each of these audio samples is placed at a different velocity. And when I click on that velocity, we can see the sample itself and then choose these to work with based on velocity. Let's go ahead and click drag to remove these out. Now we also have another option when we're bringing in multiple audio samples. So if I were to click, hold, and drag, I can press Alt on my QWERTY keyboard. And then once I release the left mouse, we have this pop-up menu here where we can choose a mapping method. So by default, this is going to be on note name. So we can click on this drop-down menu and choose note name with velocity, round robin. We have chromatic, white keys, black keys, and so on. So if I were to choose white keys, and we are sending this to a new layer, that's fine. We'll click OK. And now each of these audio samples is placed on a white key. We can click on each key group to show that sample to work with. Or a simpler way to show the various samples that are on these key groups would be to activate the MIDI select button here in the top right corner of our mapping editor. Let's go ahead and click that to make it active. And then now with my controller, I can trigger and it's automatically going to update our sampler to show the sample that was triggered. Now to the left of the MIDI select button, we have this highlight played key groups. And when we activate this, then let's actually zoom in a bit. And this is going to be the next thing we talk about. In the bottom right corner, we have the small plus and minus. And if we click on that, then we can zoom in on our mapping editor and get a better view of our key groups. This could even be useful before you bring in multiple audio samples, and you're going to be able to better place these within the mapping editor. But now that we've zoomed in a bit, we can actually see the velocity for each key group that's being triggered. So we see this horizontal black line that's going to pop up based on velocity for each of our key groups. So just be aware that these two options are here. They could be helpful for you when you are working on your mapping and sound design. Now, while a key group is selected, we're going to see the controls, the sample oscillator for that particular key group that's selected. If I click in an empty area of the mapping editor, then this oscillator is going to go away, and we're going to now have this view where we can batch process all of our key groups. So if we were to have brought in multiple drum sounds, say one shots, and we'd like to play back as one shot, then we can do so with our batch editor here. So clicking once on that, we can access normalize, we can reverse the samples, and then here, set playback type, we can choose to set as one shot, or we can choose to apply various effects to our samples as well. So again, if we have a key group selected, that batch process is going to go away. But as soon as we click off of the key group in an empty area, or we could come to our tree view and click on the layer, we then access that batch processing menu here. Now I've been pulling in audio samples from a folder here in the browser panel, and I've set this up so if I go ahead and collapse these, we can see that I have my sample library here listed for easy access within the browser panel. So if you have a drive or particular folders that you'd like to include in this browser panel so you can easily access your sample library, then we can do that by coming up to the hamburger button here. If I click on that, then down at the very bottom, we can access our local disk or any drive that you have. I'll click once on that. And then if I come to users and this brand here, and then say I'd like to have my music folder in the places, I can right click on that, add to favorite places. And then once I've done that, we can come back up to the hamburger. Let's come to this beginning. Now, when I click on places, I've also got my music folder here as well. So again, any libraries that you have in folders, you can add for easy access in the browser here. If you have anything that you'd like to remove, we can right click on that and then choose to remove from favorite places. Now, for identification and organizational purposes, we may want to rename our key groups and layers, and we can do that within the tree view. So while we're active here, I can select, say, the layer 1, and then down in our inspector, let's pull that up a little bit. We can see the name layer 1. If I double click on that, let's just call this tutorial layer, and we can see that that's been updated. If I press enter, and let's show the layer section by clicking in the top right corner here, and now our layer is titled tutorial layer. The same is going to be true for our key group. So if we select one of our key groups here, and this is actually already taken on the name of our audio sample, so this is convenient that Falcon is going to do that for us. If we click here and in the tree view, we can then update by double clicking tutorial key group, press enter, and now we can see tutorial key group. So by making use of the inspector, that we can then update the names of our key groups and layers. If we come over to our list view, we can then see our tutorial layer and our tutorial key group. Now, if we'd like to further organize our layers and key groups, we can, while we're in the list view, click on this color field and change the color of that layer. Use this swatch as the current color. I'll go ahead and click OK, and we can see that these have been updated in our mapping editor. If we come back to the tree view, know that we can do this here as well. So if I select the tutorial layer, come to the color section, I click on here, we have the color palette. I can then choose a different color, use the swatch as the current color, and we're now updated as well. Now, if we've created a layer or key group that we would like to copy or duplicate, we can do that by coming to our list view. So here we have our tutorial layer. We can come to the wrench icon, and then we have the option to cut, copy, paste, and duplicate. So if I click on duplicate, then we can see we have tutorial layer copy. Let's come to our edit view and switch to our tree view. And we can see now if I click on the tutorial layer copy, we then update to it within the edit view. Coming back to our original, we can switch back to it by accessing in the tree view. And this is going to be the same for our key groups. So if I come back to the list view, we then have our tutorial key group. I can click on the wrench. I can then cut, copy, paste, and duplicate it as well. I'll go ahead and choose duplicate. And we can now see the duplicated version here. Now let's come back to our tree view and close out our mapping editor. And we saw earlier that we can click on the plus here to add an additional oscillator to this particular key group. And then we can click on the corresponding tab to choose which one we'd like to work with. Or within the tree view, let's actually remove our duplicate copy that we created for the tutorial. And anytime we'd like to remove a layer or key group, we can select it and then right click and choose remove node at the bottom. So let's take this out for simplicity, select our tutorial key group, and then here we have our sample and additive where we were clicking on these tabs here to select. Within the tree view, we can also click to activate as well. And this is going to be really handy in the tree view if we were to have multiple layers and multiple key groups and oscillators. Then we can quickly identify and select which one we'd like to work with by using the hierarchy here in the tree view. Now, something else to be aware of is that if we were to make adjustments to the parameters within the oscillator section here, this is going to affect both or all of multiple oscillators that you may have added all at once. So if I adjust the coarse tuning here, even though we have the additive showing, let's select the sample and we can see that that coarse tuning change of -11 semitones is going to be applied to our sample as well, our sample oscillator. If we don't want that behavior, and I'm going to hold Alt and click to take this back to the default. So holding Alt and clicking will take all of our parameters back to their default state. We have this link button here. And if I go ahead and deactivate that, now when I change the coarse tuning for our sample oscillator to -12 semitones, let's come over to our additive oscillator and we can see that this is still on its default setting. So just be aware that if you would like to adjust the fine tuning or the pitch or the gain of your oscillators that are contained within one key group in relation to each other, you can do so by deactivating the link icon here. Let's come to our sample, hold Alt and take that back to the default, and let's turn the link back on. And let's actually come to the bottom here and let's expand this sample oscillator out a bit. Now, another thing about working with multiple oscillators within a key group is that if you've brought in a couple or 3 or 4 oscillators and you've done a lot of tweaking and you're really happy with what you've come up with and you want to save that so that you can use it in another Falcon project when you're working on sound design, then we can actually save that as a template. So if we were to come to our mapping editor, let's go ahead and expand that out. We can right click here, and then in the center area, we have Save Key Group Template. And so this is going to include our sample oscillator and our additive oscillator. So let's go ahead and right click on that. We'll choose to Save Key Group Template, and we will call this Tutorial Template. And let's come to the wrench icon, and let's just go ahead and clear out this multi. And what we're going to do now is right click in our mapping editor. And then now when we come to create key group, we have user template. We've got that tutorial template, as well as our key group in new layer, user template, tutorial template. So when I click on that, we can see we now have our sample and our additive oscillators. Something else to be aware of that can help you is if you're just getting started with Falcon or synthesis in general, a lot of these oscillators will come with presets that you can make use of to help you maybe jumpstart your process of working on your sound design, or to help you learn more about the oscillators, and you can see the different parameters and how they've been manipulated or adjusted and set to achieve the sound that they have. So for our additive oscillator, for instance, if we come over to the top right corner, it's going to be on default here. And this is actually just set to 1 key. So what I'm going to do is right click on this and then choose to auto extend key ranges. And now this is going to be spanned across the entire keyboard for us. So now I can go ahead and trigger this across my MIDI controller. Now, again, this is our default, but if we were to come here, then we can choose a bass sign. Let's actually power off our sample because this is triggering that sample that I loaded. Okay, then we can also use the right and left arrows to navigate to the next and previous presets. Okay, so you get the idea here. Now, if we were to left click and hold, let's choose a different type of oscillator, maybe say the analog stack. And then now here in the upper right corner, we have the same drop-down menu where we can choose a preset. And so if we hear something that we like, then we can always just take note of the settings that were used to create this particular patch, and this can help you in your learning process with synthesis and using Falcon as well. Now let's close out our sample oscillator, and I'm going to change the analog stack to the regular analog. And let's take a look at modulation. So modulation can get pretty crazy within Falcon, and so I want to give a few tips on working with it. Now, essentially anything that has a purple collar around it has modulation applied to it. So you can see our pitch here. If I select this, and this is one way that you can access your modulation by clicking here. Now our modulation panel is collapsed, but if this were expanded, then we would have seen that this switches to our pitch bend wheel. So by default, our pitch bend wheel is going to affect the pitch of our oscillator, and that makes sense. That's how most synthesizers work. We can also see that our gain has a purple collar around it. So if I click on that parameter, then you'll notice in our modulation section, this is going to update to show our amp envelope, because our amp envelope is modulating our gain, our audio level over a period of time while we're triggering this oscillator. So if I go ahead and trigger with my keyboard, Let's actually change this to a triangle. Okay, and we have this little indicator here, this small dash that kind of moves along based on the settings for our amp envelope. So if I were to increase the attack time, let's take this up a bit. Now you can see it moving slowly. I hope you can see it. Since we increased the attack time, now that indicator slowly moves up. Let's take up our release time. And now you're going to see it gradually go back down when I release the key. Okay, so we have this purple color letting us know which parameters have modulation, and then we have that dynamic indicator that's going to show how that modulation is functioning, as well as seeing it here in the modulation section as well. We've got this red point that's going to indicate our path within the envelope. Once I release the key, we're going to see that move along our release time. Now, something else you'll notice is a violet circle on the inner area of this gain control. This is basically going to let us know what parameter is highlighted, or selected rather. And anything that can be selected with that violet circle can essentially have modulation applied to it. So our pitch, as we saw, this has modulation from our pitch bend wheel, and if I click on this, we can see that violet circle on the inside, and it's now gone from our gain. So this is going to give us an indication of what parameter is actually selected. If I come to the panning, then we can see this has the violet circle, and we know we can apply modulation to that. If we come to the fine tune though, and I click on this, we can't select that. So you know you cannot apply modulation to this, and if I right click on it, I don't have the pop-up menu that would allow me to do so. Our coarse tuning, the same. Right clicking, I cannot add modulation. For our gain, I can right click and add modulation. If I left click, then we have that violet circle on the inside letting us know that that's selected. Now, if we'd like to add modulation, there are several different ways. So the first way is that we could come over to our browser, and let's come to the modulation section all the way at the end here. So if you'd like an LFO, we can click, hold, and drag, and let's put that on our panning. We can see that that's highlighted. I'll go ahead and release. And now immediately in our modulation section, this is going to show the recently added LFO modulation source that was added. And now when I trigger, let's actually come to our amp envelope and take our attack down. So anytime you want to access your modulations, you can do that in the section here by clicking on the name. These are going to be grouped by section. So this is our key group section. Okay, and this icon matches here. And then this is going to be our layer section, which we haven't added any modulation to. And this is going to be our program section. Okay, so our layer section icon, the center square is highlighted, and we can see it's highlighted here in our layer section. And also something important to note was that when I dragged in the LFO and placed that on the panning, Falcon is going to automatically place this on the program level. So let's go ahead and show the program level, and we need to show our modulations because that's off right now. When I click here, we can see our LFO. So there's a couple of different ways that you can access the LFO as well. So, but if we have the program section hidden as we did, then we can always just access it down below in our mods section by clicking here under the program layer. Okay, so we've got that LFO on our panning. And of course we can make adjustments to the depth by using the depth control here on the LFO, as well as the ratio here. And we have that dynamic indicator here as well. We can see that moving back and forth. So if I were to increase the frequency, we're going to see that gradually pick up speed. And of course we have a readout in hertz just below that. If we would like to work in time with the tempo of our DAW that we have, if we're using this as a VST within the DAW, then we can click on the metronome here, and then our frequency is going to allow us to adjust by quarter note, half, and so on. But I'm going to take that metronome off, so we move back to hertz. Okay, now another way that we can make modulation assignments is by clicking and holding on the tab in our mod section and dragging that to another parameter. So what if we would like to apply this LFO to our pulse width modulation here? We can click, hold, and drag. And actually, I accidentally changed this. So let me click, hold, and drag. This is something else to be aware of. Anytime we'd like to change the modulation type, we can just left click and hold and then choose from any here. So if we wanted a multi-envelope, then we could select that. Double click to add points. And we can see that that indicator is showing that new movement that we've set up. Let's click, hold, and drag onto our pulse width modulation. And we can adjust the ratio for it here. Okay, and another way that we can go about adding modulations is by right-clicking on the parameter in question. So maybe say the start phase here. If we were to right-click on this, we can add modulation. We can then choose from a variety of sources here. These external are going to be MIDI CC. We've got voice, other. We can choose internal, whether it's going to be at the program layer, and we can see that multi-envelope that we've been working with. We can choose something and place it on the layer, and we can choose for the key group as well. And we can see our amp envelope, which is here. So I'm going to place this on the layer section. And right now in our mod section, you can see for our layer section, there's nothing there. So once I choose, say, the new drunk, we can see that that shows up for our layer section within the mod area here. And this is going to be on bipolar by default, but our setting is all the way down to 0. So I'm going to change this to take that off. And now we're going to be in unipolar. So we're going to only move in a positive value. Let's take that rate down a bit more. Now we've seen that we can access the modulation in our modulation section down below by clicking on the particular parameter we'd like to adjust. We can see that updates when I select the pulse width modulation. If I go back to the start phase, we can see that there. If we come to our gain, we're going to see our amp envelope. And if we come to our panning, we can see our multi-envelope here. But another way that we can access our modulation is by right-clicking on the parameter. Remember that anything with the purple collar around it is going to have modulation applied to it. So any of these we can right-click on and we can choose to edit the modulations, and we're going to have this pop-up window. So this is going to be useful in the instance that, say, we were to make use of these icons up above here and hide the modulation section, then we can always just right-click, edit modulations, and we're going to have this pop-up window where we can make adjustments to the parameter of the modulation source that's applied to it. So if we come to our pulse width modulation and right click, edit modulations, now we can edit our multi-envelope. Now these modulation sources are going to be named by their type by default, but for instance, if we would like to rename these to make them better identifiable when our mod section is open. So right now we have amp, drunk, and multi. If I were to right click on our panning, this is assigned to our multi. So we could double click on the tab, and then we have this pop-up window where I can go ahead and put in pan envelope, press enter to accept that, and now this is going to be renamed in our mod section, which can help it to be better identifiable, especially if we have assigned a modulation source to multiple parameters to achieve a certain sort of effect. Then we can come up with a name that's going to help us to identify what this modulation source is doing within our patch. Now, the last thing I'll say about modulations that I think is important to be aware of is that any modulation source that we apply to parameters at our key group level and below are going to be per voice. So if we add at the layer, that this is not going to be the case. If we add at the program layer, this is not going to be the case. But if you'd like to add modulation per voice for your oscillators, then you'll need to do it for the oscillator section and the key group section. So the modulation source can still be on your layer or your program section. It's just you need to apply it to the parameters in the key group or oscillator sections for it to be per voice. Okay, let's go ahead and clear out this multi, and the very last thing we're going to talk about is changing the resolution for the user interface for any soundware that we may purchase from UVI. So let's come back to our browser, and I'm going to collapse the places. Let's open up our Soundbase, and so here I have this Prime 8 Plus, and if I expand that out, let's go ahead and double click to open up an initial preset. Okay, now that's been loaded and it's taken us to the info page. Now on the info page, we're going to be able to access macros and the user interfaces that are created by UVI and other third-party providers to make tweaks to the particular preset that we're working on. And as you can see, this is pretty small to work with. So if you're working with soundware that you're having this issue with, we can always change the scaling for this within our preferences menu. So coming up to the wrench icon, if we come to the preferences, and then here we have UI scaling and script scaling. Now it's important, it's not intuitive. You may think you want to choose the UI scaling, but this is going to be for our Falcon instrument. We want the scaling for that soundware, and that's what we want here. So that's going to be on 100% by default, but if I were to change this to 50, then we can see that this is going to expand out, and it's a little bit fuzzy because it's made the change while it's open. If we were to, let's clear the multi and then reload, now we've got the crispy version. So after you've made that adjustment to the scaling and your preferences, you'll probably want to go ahead and clear out that multi and then reload the soundware that you're trying to use, and you're going to have this crystal clear, nice, shiny, big size interface to work with. This is going to be much better to go ahead and program and work with in your sound design. All right, so finally we're going to wrap up here. I hope that you got some useful tidbits. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them down below, and I will see you in the next tutorial.